When Samsung released the Galaxy S20 Ultra at the start of 2020, they changed everything. They threw out their rulebook for steady innovation in favor of throwing everything into a phone. With that too, brought a new moniker, the Ultra flagship. Samsung have just released the S24 Ultra. So it's time to see just how far we've come from 2020's version of Ultra to 2024. Let's go. S20 Ultra, Note 20 Ultra, S21 Ultra, S22 Ultra, S23 Ultra, and finally S24 Ultra. 6 generations of Ultra have been released, each one with big screens and even bigger numbers. From the Galaxy S10 to the Galaxy S20 Ultra, Samsung pushed hard. They threw everything into a smartphone and then charged you for it. The S20 Ultra gave Samsung a lot of lessons to learn, but it was the foundation for building what is now a very capable and pretty much phone of the year every year smartphone brand in the Ultra flagship category. There was a lot of lessons they learned just building the everything phone, and they've refined and honed things as the years have gone on. So let's see how they did it. We're going to cover the Ultra today across all of the usual categories you can imagine. Design and display, we're going to look at camera, we're going to look at how the hardware's evolved, and also the output and the processing for photos and videos. Then we're going to look at the performance side of things, but not in your let's do a battery test and see which one lasts the longest. We're going to look more at day-to-day sort of tasks like video editing and photo processing, and just see which one sort of comes out on top in those sort of tasks, and then reflect back on my usage across all the years with these phones as well. Let's kick it off, of course, with the design and the display. Okay, for design and the display, we're kind of going to take it a generation at a time just to reflect back on what Samsung were thinking at the time when it comes to the design of the phone. Starting with the S20 Ultra. The design for this phone was all about the front. Samsung made this thing massive in terms of its physical size. The bezels were slim, the screen was huge, 6.9 inches, Quad HD Plus, and Samsung's first high refresh rate panel at 120Hz. It was heavily curved both in the front and the back, and holding it feels substantially lighter compared to today's phones, even though for the time it was definitely a heavy phone to hold. Around the back though, the design left a lot to be desired. It's almost as if Samsung had all these cameras and didn't know what to do with it and just made it this chunky bit of island that all the cameras sat in. And they didn't hide it. They weren't trying to meld it in with the glass and sort of make it disappear. It was very intentional that these cameras were noticeable. They wanted people to see it and ask, what's going on back there? We'll get to cameras later on in the video, but there was a big statement that Samsung made with this sort of camera island. The thing is it wasn't well received. People didn't like its garish appearance and shoving words like space zoom 100x in your face. It was a design that people didn't really care for, and I myself included was one of those. The glossy glass back, it sort of had a nice grippy feel to it, but it just had a bit of a cheap feel to it. I don't know how to describe it. Now that I guess I've used matte phones for the last 4 or 5 years, this doesn't feel as premium to hold in the hand. Its display was pretty class leading for its time. The only drawback, I guess you could say, was whilst it had the 120Hz, you couldn't run 120Hz and Quad HD Plus at the same time. You either had to put up with Quad HD Plus and 60Hz, or lower the resolution to get that high refresh rate. It also wasn't adaptive. It was fixed to that 120Hz as well. That kind of put a bit of a drain on the battery, but we'll talk about battery and performance a little bit later. Outdoors wise, the brightness was absolutely fine. You could have no trouble seeing the display outdoors in this environment. Samsung put the peak brightness at 1250 nits here. You had a great panel outdoors, and you can see that from when I do outdoor testing. You had absolutely no problem seeing things outside. Fast forward 6 months, Samsung learned a lot from their mistakes with the S20 Ultra and rectified a lot with them with the Note 20 Ultra. The thing was with the Note, Samsung had a bit of a base to work from already. The Note 10 Plus already had this exceptionally premium design and a camera housing and module that kind of lent itself into being premium already too. Samsung had kind of nailed it already with the Note 10 Plus. They just pretty much iterated that a little bit further forward. And even though it's still got the camera island, it actually looks a lot more purposeful. Whereas the S20 Ultra was just big, garish sort of rectangle, this kind of looked a little bit sleeker and fit the appearance of the phone a bit nicer, especially as they consolidated the sensors down to a bit of a tighter form as well. But the Note's all about that industrial look, the squared off corners, the rounded frame, the heavily curved frame, I must say, the back glass and the front panel definitely had those drastic curves, and the phone was almost impossibly thin for the power that it had inside it. You still carried Samsung's 6.9-inch Quad HD Plus display and their first adaptive refresh rate panel as well. But again, like the S20 Ultra, you could not run 120Hz and Quad HD Plus at the same time. It was another limitation that Samsung put onto the Note 20 Ultra. A lot of people speculate as to what that was. I think it was just because the Exynos 990 perhaps couldn't render it properly, so they kept it even across the board between Snapdragon and Exynos. But again, that's a performance conversation for later. It was amazing design. I really like how comfortable the Note 20 Ultra feels in the hand and how it just feels like this crazy thin phone. Thing was though, Samsung sacrificed sort of a lot of internals to make this design happen. There was actually the first time Samsung put a glossy and a matte finish option available. It just depended on the color you wanted. So the black one that I've got here, I guess you could call it black, was the glossy glass, as was the white, whereas the Mystic Bronze was Samsung's first step into that matte glass at the back, and I was here for it. I absolutely loved it. The curved display was a nice aesthetic choice, definitely looked more premium and felt more comfortable to hold, but it did have some function issues. The S Pen didn't have the surface area that you'd normally get, and also the accidental touches on the side. They were definitely a thing, as much as I don't like to remember they were. Outdoor brightness for the display had absolutely no issues. It carried over that excellent panel from the S20 Ultra for brightness purposes and stuck it in here as well. And again, you don't really have an issue seeing this outdoors if you still have it in 2024. So these two Ultras, this wasn't really the upgrade to this. The S20 Ultra had its natural successor in the Galaxy S21 Ultra. Problem solved was what MKBHD said when he reviewed the Galaxy S21 Ultra, which won his Phone of the Year when this came out. Samsung pretty much fixed every problem that anyone had with the S20 Ultra. The design, Samsung made this absolutely beautiful camera module on the back where the aluminium frame sort of melded into the camera module and back again. It was beautiful, and the phantom color options too. I really liked the phantom black. I had the phantom black myself when I used it, but I went and bought the phantom silver just to try something different. But those color options, like even the way the color sort of reflects in the light, stunning. The display, Samsung fixed that too. It could run adaptive refresh rates of 120Hz with Quad HD Plus turned on at the same time. So there was absolutely no limitations to how you interacted from a fluidity standpoint, but also from a resolution standpoint as well. The thing was though, the design from the front, and I guess you could say about that, any of the phones from that time period, is it looked like the S20 Ultra. You'd be hard pressed to find the differences from a distance. I could see it, especially with the front display. Samsung made it a little bit flatter, and the back glass kind of was a little bit, I don't know how you describe the back glass on this thing. Back glass was a little bit less curved. No, I know what it is. Samsung thickened the frame from the S20 Ultra to the S21 Ultra. Definitely made you feel like you were holding a different phone. It felt substantially different, even if from the front it didn't look it. This was Samsung's best design work on a smartphone to date. I don't care what phones they bring out in the future or that they've brought out in the past. This was them at their peak. They absolutely owned this camera module, turned it into a beautiful piece of art that sits on the back, and the finishes and the colorways that were on offer were the best that Samsung have had to this day. It was also Samsung's first S series that supported S Pen input. It was a separate pen that you buy individually, but it still meant that Samsung were transforming their S lineup, and this was like the beginning of the S and Note sort of merging. Its panel and screen were still one of the best Samsung has made. Outdoor brightness, absolutely no issue. Interactivity, absolutely no issue. This will not look out of place for years to come. This design will be timeless, and I think people will be still using this phone for a long time to come. Which is crazy that just 1 year later, they scrapped it and they brought out the S22 Ultra, which pretty much is a Note. I say that a bit tongue-in-cheek because I know deep down this is more than just a Note rebrand. Samsung definitely melded the lines together, and the way you can tell by that is the way that S was normally this camera-focused creator's phone, and the Note was more this productivity-focused feature phone. Samsung packed both in here. They brought the cameras that the S series would normally get and packed it in with the productivity that you get from the Note. It just so happens that it's in a more Note-like package versus what the S series would normally get. So with that rebranding in mind, Samsung probably couldn't keep that design that they had. They had to go back and sort of create something new. And to be honest, what they created is still really nice. That minimalistic floating camera on the back gives you that really nice aesthetic, clean and minimal, and sort of matches the phone's industrial design. I really like it. What I like to say is it's basically just a thicker Note 20 Ultra, because the mid frame is now symmetrical with the back glass versus the Note 20 Ultra having a really thin mid-frame. This mid-frame is thick, which means it's obviously giving you more battery, and the included S Pen sort of comes along with that as well. From a display point of view, it sort of bumps up the S21 Ultra, goes to a 1750 nit peak brightness panel, and you still of course get the adaptive refresh rate 1 to 120 Hz and also Quad HD+. Samsung also brought in the adaptive technology where when you go outdoors, it will adjust the color accuracy to the brightness level, which I thought was really good. They did extend on that with the S23 Ultra, but this is not that part. Every time I go back to this phone, I miss the comfort of how it feels. The way that the glass and the frame kind of seamlessly mold around each other and then curve sort of ever so effortlessly from back to front glass. It was a pretty good design achievement, but again, being the fact that you need the S Pen to sort of glide across most of the display kind of made it hard with the edges on the screen to do that. Again, outdoor brightness, you have an incredible peak brightness level, and you can see that when you do take it outdoors. You don't have any issues at all. So after this came out, Samsung pretty much went into refinement mode. Enter S23 Ultra. The thing about this phone is before it even came out, people were talking about how bored they were. Oh, it just looks like an S22 Ultra. And yes, surface level, I would agree with them. But it's when you get this phone in your hand that you realize the subtle improvements Samsung made to design that made this thing so much better. The flattened sides with the frame, the flattened front glass, the fact it's still got some subtle curves to feel comfortable when it's in your hand, but removing that feel of accidental touches and the dysfunction of not being able to glide the S Pen everywhere. The panel pretty much remained the same. The only subtle difference Samsung did was improve some different step brightness for the adaptive sort of vision booster that Samsung brought in. I kind of liken it to the change Samsung made when they went to the S21 Ultra from S20. They removed sort of the drastic curves and focused more on comfort and in-hand feel. And that's what we got with the S23 Ultra. It really gave it that more in-hand comfort, in-hand practicality, I think is what I'll call it, despite the fact that the curves felt really nice. And of course, S24 Ultra is where we're at now. And again, it was more of a refinement year from Samsung from a design overhaul point of view. And I think that's kind of what you've seen from the last 3 generations, is Samsung kind of found a formula and refined it. The S24 Ultra is, I would say, the peak of Samsung design over the Ultra phones that have been released. Samsung completely flattened everything, the flat back glass, the flat front glass, but they've kept the mid-frame curved. And I think that was a good decision because it still gives that in-hand comfort that the previous Ultra phones have got with that curved sort of aspect to it. The thing is though, is that the display, there is no contest. Samsung went from just keeping the same display, or pretty much there or thereabouts for the last 5 or 6 years, only bumping up the peak brightness and tweaking a couple of things, to making the best display on a smartphone, period. The S24 Ultra with its 1 to 120 Hz refresh rate, with its Quad HD Plus resolution, the adaptive vision booster, with the anti-reflectivity coating, with the 2600 nits of peak brightness, it's the complete package of the display that you can get on a smartphone right now. When you compare all of the displays in front of each other, you will see the improvement that Samsung have made to that reflectivity. It's no contest here. And even taking photos outdoors, you line them up side by side, this just will win every time. We might see something different next year from the Ultra, but this is what we got this year, and I think it's almost like Samsung were building towards this, and now they've achieved it. Okay, that was a long design intro. This video is stacked, so make sure you grab some snacks. We're now getting to camera. And before we look at output, I want to reflect on the hardware that Samsung have brought in with the Ultra phones over the last 5 years. From a surface level, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the hardware has remained pretty stagnant. The only things that Samsung seem to have tweaked is some resolution bumps in the main camera, and also reconfiguring the telephoto arrangement. Because functionally, they've all had folded periscope lenses, they've all had high resolution cameras, most of them have had macro capability with the ultra wide. So really, what have they changed? Well, the answer is a lot. When we go back to the S20 Ultra and look at what Samsung introduced, it was a massive jump from S10 to S20. Samsung brought in a massive 108 megapixel main camera, a 4x 48 megapixel camera that was marked as 5x in the software, and then a 0.5 ultra wide camera. Samsung kind of stepped things up a little bit and tried to give you more on the Ultra flagship front. Features like 8K were introduced, features like single take, Samsung really stepped it up and brought things in. But there was issues. The S20 Ultra had huge focusing issues at launch that a lot of people could not forgive. A lot of that was down to the fact that Samsung went with a time of flight sensor instead of an autofocus module alongside that massive camera that they introduced. They rectified that with the Note 20 Ultra, but then pared back the periscope camera to just a 12 megapixel 5x. And then the S21 Ultra, as MKBHD said, solved everything. It reintroduced the laser autofocus module alongside an improved 108 megapixel camera, and then instead of a 48 megapixel 5x or 4x camera, they split it into two. A 10 megapixel 3x camera with dual pixel autofocus, and a 10x 10 megapixel camera also with dual pixel autofocus to handle that longer range zoom. And it was a success. Immediately everyone praised the flexibility of the camera, the fact that you had all of this range to go between. Samsung hit a winner. So they didn't change it. For the next S21 Ultra, pretty much the S23 Ultra, even though the S23 Ultra went up to 200 megapixel, the sensor sizes, the arrangement, the focal lengths remained the same, which was a bit of a strange move. Alongside that and parallel to that was a lot of competitors rapidly developing sensor technology in smartphones. Samsung were prepared to take it a bit slower and focus on processing and output. And when we get to the S24 Ultra now, I think that was a really right decision because they've refined the hardware, they've found a configuration that works, high resolution main camera, dual pixel ultra wide with macro capabilities, a 3x camera that's good for mid-range zoom, and then now a 5x with high resolution to do everything else beyond that. And on paper, that 200 megapixel jump from 108 megapixel was a lot stronger than what people gave it credit for. You got quad pixel autofocus versus just standard autofocus, which meant that the focusing speed and capture speed was going to be a lot quicker. Samsung did make things better with the S23 Ultra, as much as people don't like you to believe that they did. The improved hardware also brought improved capabilities. Starting with the S20 Ultra, you got 8K 30 from the main camera versus 8K 24 and a terrible crop. They really went to work and fixed things as years gone on. Some would argue it was a bit slow, but I think the way Samsung are doing things now with their cameras is to give you a better overall experience versus just pumping you with numbers. Okay, output time. The way I'm going to break this output comparison down is I'm going to do it by device and then compare it to the next one up to see how Samsung have sort of slowly sloped up the improvements. I'll start with two phones that were released in the same year, the S20 Ultra and the Note 20 Ultra. These two phones, on paper, should really be theoretically putting out the same thing. And all that's down to the fact they both had the Exynos 990 processor, well, at least in Australia. So on paper, when I say they should be the same, then output-wise, yeah, they are the same. And you can see that here. In a lot of different scenarios, the photos are producing and processing pretty much identically. What was different was the zoom, and that's because they had two different zoom cameras. Despite having both 5x in the software, the Note 20 Ultra's 5x was built differently. It was a 12 megapixel 5x camera with a folded periscope lens, and then the S20 Ultra was a 4x version of that with a 48 megapixel resolution. What was different is how they processed photos, and you can see that difference when they're side by side at the 5x length. What I did notice was better was the nighttime on Note 20 Ultra was substantially improved. Samsung must have improved the processing from the S20 Ultra to Note 20 Ultra. Even though there's been multiple software updates now since they've both come out, there's still a difference. The video I compared was very similar, both in output and in stabilization. When you're looking at the stabilization video here, there's not much of a discernible difference, and even in output and processing, you don't actually notice too much, and they both shot at 4K 30. These two comparing aren't really the point of this comparison because they were released in the same year, and the Note and the S were kind of different markets. What was more interesting was comparing the S20 Ultra to the S21 Ultra. What you start to see here is a shift in Samsung's processing. The S21 Ultra favored a warmer sort of finish and a bit more contrast in the photos. You can see that here with photos of the tree and the building, and you've got some cloud photos as well, which I'll sort of put up as I'm sort of talking. That the S21 Ultra changed things up a little bit. There was probably a jump in processing with the new processor that came on board, and yeah, you can see that. The S21 Ultra was the first dedicated 10x camera as well, and it did give you some more better results at that optical range at that 10x level. What you got better at though was at 30x. The optical zoom started further out. It meant it could capture closer and give you a better result, more detail. Samsung improved the 108 megapixel camera too, and the detail difference you can see side by side is definitely there because the resolution and the processing got better at that high range. The S21 Ultra was the first Ultra with macro capabilities, and the macro photo, you can see the S20 Ultra can't focus at all. An Ultra with the ultra wide camera with dual pixel and laser autofocus was able to get right in there and capture a nice clean shot. The nighttime capabilities, wow, what a change. Samsung must have done some magic with night mode processing because the detail difference and the processing difference are worlds apart from each other. Samsung really stepped it up there with night mode with the S20 Ultra versus the S20. In video, you can see a real big improvement in video stabilization as you're sort of walking along with both phones. The S20 Ultra, I don't know why it was so bad. It had OIS. It just must have been a really early primitive version of it for that main camera, because the S21 Ultra, that next generation, was far better and you could take much more stable footage with it. I did not bother with 8K with either of these first Ultra phones. It's just not worth it because it was a disaster and it didn't improve until last year with the S23 Ultra. Okay, stepping up now and bringing in the S22 Ultra versus the S21 Ultra. That shift to warmer tones continues. Samsung heads in that direction even further with the S22 Ultra versus what they already started with the S21 Ultra, even though this is a Snapdragon on the S22 Ultra versus the Exynos. They also lent even further into dark contrasting with buildings, and especially with clouds. I noticed too that darker contrast really set in, bringing out a bit more grey in the clouds. Samsung still managed to get more detail out of the main camera at the 12 megapixel resolution, even though it was technically the same camera. You know, getting with the rocks, for example, could see more detail. This is what was crazy, is even with the same exact camera setup, the 10 times and beyond, Samsung still got more out of it. The processing just got so much better at that level, thanks to the new ISP that Samsung brought in with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1. And that also extends to the high resolution mode at 108 megapixel. You can get more detail out of that. Even though it's 108 megapixel, you'd think it'd be built the same. That's not the case. Samsung got more out of it, again, thanks to processing. It was the second Ultra with macro capabilities, and functionally and output wise, it performs the same. The night mode got clearer again, and that's pretty evident not just in the photo of the bridge that I've been using, but also in this photo of my car, sort of in a really dark street. You can see the raindrops on the car so much clearer on the S22 Ultra versus the S21 Ultra. Samsung said they improved the video stabilization, and you can see that kind of. There's a definite improvement in it, but it's nowhere near the level that you'll see when we jump up from S22 Ultra to S23 Ultra in a moment. When it comes to the processing of video, you'll notice that there's a slight shift in darker contrast with the S22 Ultra, but it's nothing too noticeable. It's not enough to be like, I'm going to throw my S20 Ultra away. The stabilization was a noticeable better, but again, wait for the next one. Now we bring in last year's S23 Ultra versus the S22 Ultra. And this is where you can see Samsung kind of change the processing, but almost revert back in a way, because they took away the warmer tones that they were building and brought back in the cooler tones from the S20 Ultra, but with more detail and contrast along with it. The new 200 megapixel main camera did a lot for the way it captured detail, like trees and rocks, for example. It brought a lot more of that stuff out. And even though, again, they used the same 3 and 10x cameras, Samsung still were able to extract more out of it with the new ISP that the 8 Gen 2 for Galaxy brought in. So at that 10x and beyond especially, it was definitely processing more information and giving you a sharper image at the end of it. What was a big noticeable change was that 200 versus 108 megapixel. Samsung changed things drastically by bringing 200 megapixel in. Even though the sensor size remained the same, Samsung brought in quad pixel technology, and at lower resolutions that helped with bringing in more light, but it even helped at higher resolutions too, because it just meant focusing was better and you're getting more information through each pixel. And at that 200 megapixel range versus 108, you can see the difference in the building as you sort of creep in. The thing I noticed though was that night mode got brighter, but not better. The S22 Ultra had, in my opinion, a more realistic looking night mode versus the S23 Ultra, which just brightened it up. And it's really weird. It did have more detail in the bridge shot that I noticed, but it was just too bright, which I didn't really like. And that stabilization improvement I mentioned before is here. With 4K 30 walking side by side, the S22 Ultra to S23 Ultra, the jump in stabilization was massive. Samsung touted a 2 times wider OIS correction angle, and yeah, that's evident. It is so much smoother with the S23 Ultra, and that in terms of video capabilities was worth the jump alone. That's probably a bit drastic. But what I mean by that is it wasn't the only video capability improvement. It just showed where Samsung were focusing. They wanted video to be a priority, and it definitely felt better. Overall, video improved, and that extended out to resolutions that you most likely will never use in 8K 30. You're able to get so much better 8K footage because not only is the crop right, but also the frame rate is right. It's not choppy and laggy. It's actually smooth and captures everything appropriately and gives you usable and very nice 8K footage. And then we jump into the current generation S24 Ultra and put it against the S23 Ultra. I did already a full comparison between these two phones, so you can go and watch that if you like. But effectively, to recap that and sort of continue the trajectory that we're on, Samsung reverted back. They did a 180 and went to cooler tones. They've done another 180 and gone back to warmer tones. There's like a warmish overtone to the photos in the S24 Ultra compared to S23 Ultra. What I also really like too is Samsung improved the processing when it comes to detail. It's more natural now. It doesn't seem so over sharpened artificially, and it comes across when you sort of crop into the photo. You can see that. That change is apparent. But alongside the warmer processing, Samsung have implemented a darker sort of contrast slightly in terms of shadows and sort of in the clouds, which kind of is like a mix between what they've had before with the S22 Ultra and the detail of the S23 Ultra. They've kind of combined things all together and sort of giving us everything they've learnt over the past 5 years. What's also improved is the zoom range, and whilst the 10 times camera on the S23 Ultra is exceptional, the zoom range and flexibility is better on the S24 Ultra. Because you can go between 5 and 10 and have optical light quality anywhere in between, versus the S23 Ultra, which doesn't have that capability. What is also better too is the 200 megapixel has much improved detail when you crop into the photo. It might not seem like much when you're zoomed out, but as you sort of get in, you can see it's retaining more information. That might not seem like much, but when you're using parts of that photo to crop and make other photos, it can be all the difference. The macro mode, it kind of largely unchanged. What is changed is night mode. The night mode processing, Samsung has improved. It's darker again, but it's got the detail back. So it's got the darker sort of tones from the S22 Ultra and the detail from the S23 Ultra, and sort of made a baby with night mode. It's much better, and I prefer it over the insanely, intensely bright S23 Ultra that I got. It is the most stable video footage yet. So even though the S23 Ultra was very, very good, the S24 Ultra extends it out even further. Only marginally, but it's enough to notice. And the processing of video is also a little bit different too. There's the darker contrast in the clouds, which kind of gives it a bit more life. The S23 Ultra, it almost flattened out any life in the clouds and sort of made it sort of mesh into one, which you didn't really notice at the time, but when you see it side by side with something else, you do see it. There's a lot of other differences between these two, down to do with software and modes, which I've already covered in that other video, so I'm not going to cover them again here. And then just for fun, I did an S20 Ultra versus S24 Ultra, just to sort of see how far we've come from that first generation Ultra to now. Immediately what you notice is that the S24 Ultra gives you more balanced, more detailed photos in its processing. The S20 Ultra, what I really noticed was it looked flat and washed out, like it wasn't sort of a photo taken that had processing at all. It was just washed out and sort of cool and grey. I don't know, it just didn't look appealing, especially when you compare it to the full of life S24 Ultra photos I was getting. The zoom comparison extends that even further, because it's almost as if the further Samsung went with the S20 Ultra zoom, the less processing they were doing, or they were just not capturing the scene properly or adjusting the settings. The S24 Ultra had some consistent processing between the cameras, which it didn't seem like the S20 Ultra had, especially now that you compare these two phones. They both have that 5x optical quality, especially when you consider they're both high-resolution telephoto cameras. But the S24 Ultra just slays the S20 Ultra. It held up okay in previous comparisons, but now when you compare it to this year's one, yeah, it's much better on the S24 Ultra. Night mode's another mismatch. It handles light a lot better, so from like street lamps or from like the street lamps. And the detail's also a lot better when you consider and look at things like the tiles and the sort of bumpy parts in the ground in the foreground of the photo. The thing though where you notice the most improvement is video. Samsung have obviously been focusing on video as a bit of a point of attention in the past few years, and you can see how much and how far they've come with the S24 Ultra. Stabilization's a complete mismatch, as is the processing and the output. You're getting far better. And again, 8K, well, it was unfair. The S20 Ultra was just not good. I also wanted to test portrait mode, but what I wanted to do was sort of hand it over to you to judge While the photos are up, I'll sort of just give some information I found whilst taking portrait photos. The thing I found quite interesting was the S20 Ultra, the S21 Ultra, and the Note 20 Ultra sandwiched in between that. They all were able to take 2x portrait mode crops from the main camera, which I found quite interesting because just 1 year after the S21 Ultra, the S22 Ultra, God, I'm saying Ultra a lot, it was not doing 2x portraits. Samsung offered 1 and 3x and nothing in between, which I found quite interesting. But then with the S23 Ultra, through a software update later, Samsung brought it back in. And of course, the S24 Ultra, you've got 1, 2, 3, and 5. Something to be said about the 5x portraits that you get from the S24 Ultra. Out of all the portrait photos I took, that is by far my favorite. It is so dramatic and gives you this real impact when you look at it. I love it. I also tested the selfies, and again, I'll just sort of let you be the judge. The thing I found with selfie cameras is that from pretty much the S20 Ultra, skipping the Note 20 Ultra, obviously, to the S22 Ultra, Samsung had a 40 megapixel selfie camera on the front. And then with the S23 Ultra, Samsung brought in the 12 megapixel dual pixel autofocus selfie camera, and things improved, and the selfie camera on the S24 Ultra is the same. The Note 20 Ultra had a 10 megapixel selfie camera. It wasn't great, and I'm sure when you looked at all the photos you could have seen that yourself. Before we move on to, I'd really like to test out the microphones, because again, Samsung put this emphasis on video as time went on, and the way I'm going to test this is I'm going to sort of do a bit of a talking piece to camera with each phone and using portrait video mode so we can see the steady improvement both in detail and output in that as well. So starting with the S20 Ultra and working our way all the way up to the S24 Ultra. This is the portrait video from the S20 Ultra and also the microphone capabilities of the S20 Ultra. It's in a pretty quiet environment, although there's some concrete. Let me know how it sounds. This is the Note 20 Ultra, one generation ahead. Audio, sound, portrait video mode, again, reverb, and even some noise with my son watching TV. Which one sounds better? How does this sound? S21 Ultra's turn. This is still full HD video. The S20 Ultra and Note 20 Ultra still full HD portrait video. There's a difference. This can do 3 times. I'm not going to test it because it'll be too close. But how's this sound? What's the sound quality like? Same conditions, same environment. S22 Ultra's turn. This is still full HD. Samsung was still 1 year away from 4K portrait video mode. So how does this look? I think as the years gone on, Samsung increased the capability, made it look less artificial. You let me know. And we have the S23 Ultra with 4K portrait video mode. Substantial jump up in quality. I think you'll definitely agree with me here. I've kind of watched each video back and yeah, this will look the most natural so far. Wait till you see the S24 Ultra. But also, how's the microphone sound? What's been the best so far? Here's the S24 Ultra, its turn. Let me know which one you think has done the best from the audio, from the visual side of things. They've all probably done okay. I would say there's been a steady improvement, but that's for you to judge. Let me know in the comments which one has done the best. You let me know which one of the comments was the best. Personally, I obviously know. I think the S24 Ultra will have done the better, but that's your job to tell me. Okay, performance. This is a real tricky one to sort of nail down, especially in the limited time I've sort of had to put this together. I have a lot of reference because I used each of these phones extensively over the course of, when they came out. The thing you notice and immediately can say is that the Exynos 990 and just the Exynos in general have not been favorable to consumers. The Exynos 990 in particular was probably the worst Samsung flagship chipset that's been made. And that's a little bit hyperbole because day to day, the operation of the phone is fine. The only problem you had with it was that, day to day, operationally was fine. Just your day was shorter because the battery efficiency was not very good. The Exynos 2100 kind of revived things on the S21 Ultra, and the Exynos 2200 kicked it along a little bit further too, but there was just too big of a gap opening up with Snapdragon for Samsung to ignore. So with the S23 Ultra, they shut up shop with Exynos for that year and just used Snapdragon. Obviously, we have Exynos back now with the 2400, and it is far better than what it used to be. I would say it's nearly neck and neck with the Snapdragon in terms of performance output. Yet to see about efficiency, time will tell with that. But output-wise, you're getting a much better experience. The way I like to test how this is going to look like is through video exporting. I think it's a really good marker for the ceiling that you're going to get from performance and speed because it tests everything. It tests the sort of the speed of getting stuff done. It also tests the battery drain on something like that. And it also just tests you know, something that people might do. They might want to make a quick video on their phone to send to their friends or to upload somewhere. This will give them a good test to showcase where the improvements have been. So for video exporting, I basically sent the same 4 clips to each phone, a 4K 30 clips taken with the S24 Ultra, and I wanted to see how fast it would go. I lined them all up. I did the test twice, to be honest. I first did it individually to see, I guess, if I wanted to frame it up that way and show the speed of getting it done. And then I thought I'd do it again and line them up all together. I liked the second way better. The reason why, I was able to start the older phones first and sort of move down. And what I noticed was how fast the newer phones sped up and overtook them and how slow the older phones were. The S20 Ultra and Note 20 Ultra running Exynos 990 were painfully slow. I speak in context because painful depends on your definition of painful, but in context to how fast the new ones were, yeah, it was painful. You can see how fast the newer ones were too. Like, they saved the movie so much quicker than what the S20 Ultra and Note 20 Ultra did. Even the S21 Ultra and S22 Ultra, there wasn't much of an improvement in that, and the S23 Ultra was very good with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 for Galaxy. So yeah, you can see there's an absolute performance improvement there. And when it comes to like things like photo editing, again, the Lightroom exporting process was a lot faster on the newer phones. It's just a mismatch. It's crazy that that was considered good. Well, actually, it was never considered good on the S20 Ultra. The thing was that on paper, the specs of battery were the same. The S20 Ultra, all the way through the S24 Ultra, with the exception of the Note 20 Ultra, that's kind of the outlier in the family, all charged at 45 watts and had a 5,000 mAh battery. Yet, the battery life was not built equal. Samsung had so much work to do with refining the efficiency of the processors as the years went on. Crazy to think that despite same capacity batteries, that we have a much longer battery life now with the S24 Ultra, even though the capacities, like I said, are the same. The other part to performance too is S Pen. Pretty much all the phones support S Pen bar one, the S20 Ultra. The S21 Ultra supports it, but through a separate accessory that you have to purchase, whereas the Note 20 Ultra and S22 Ultra and up all have the S Pen inbuilt. Over time too, that S Pen has improved. Samsung has reduced the latency when it hits the screen and made it feel super responsive. It's crazy what they've been able to do with that pen just in a few short years. From a software point of view, the only phone that's going to be getting oneui 6.1 will likely be the S21 Ultra. The Note 20 Ultra and S20 Ultra are finished when it comes to major OS updates, which is a shame, but I think judging from their performance, probably a good thing. S23 Ultra or S23 series will likely be the only one getting Galaxy AI, reportedly. So that means that if you have an S22 Ultra and below, you can forget about using Galaxy AI for now. And of course, the S24 Ultra starts with oneui 6.1, and as Samsung have promised, 7 years of major OS support going forward. So that could be a factor that you might want to consider if you're using any of these older phones. If you jump forward to S24 Ultra, you've got support for a very long time. Overall, that was a big comparison. That was a lot of phones, a lot of money spent to bring stuff in. I know that the S20 Ultra was broken, so don't talk about that. Functionally, it performs great, and I was able to pick it up a bit cheaper by doing it that way. Hopefully this can help if you are looking at upgrading from one of these older phones, just to see where the improvements might be. Even if you're not going to the S24 Ultra, maybe you want to go from an S20 to S22. This might help. If there's any of these phones that you'd like a deeper dive comparison to the S24 Ultra with, let me know, because I made one last year comparing the Note 20 Ultra to the S23 Ultra, and it helped a lot of people. So if you think any of these other phones are worth doing that as well, let me know in the comments below. And of course, videos like this aren't easy to make, so I would appreciate your support by subscribing to the channel and going back and watching one of my other videos. I've got plenty for you to choose from. If you want to know more about how to get the most out of your Samsung, this is the place to be. If you want to see some more of my inane thoughts about Samsung phones and a bit more of a casual conversation, come follow me on my socials. I'm on X/Twitter and also on Instagram. I'll see you in the next one. You!